There is an old rule in Dusk March that a voiceless thing cannot argue with its sentence, and the lords who threw the mute Omega into the Alpha King's cage were counting on it. Had any of them stopped to ask why a girl who could not scream would go so quietly to her death, they might have kept her far from him. Not one of them asked. The keep called her Neve, when it troubled to call her anything at all. A name was a small courtesy, and courtesies in Vale Keep were spent on those who could give thanks for them. Neve had never once given thanks for anything in her life. She had been born without a voice, or the voice had been born without her. And no one had ever been able to say which. By the time she was old enough to understand that other children cried out when they were hurt and laughed aloud when they were glad, she had already learned to do neither where it could be seen. Silence, she had discovered early, was read as many things. Simpleness, mostly. Weakness, always. It never once occurred to the people above her that a girl who says nothing might be a girl who hears everything and forgets none of it. She had spent 19 winters folding sheets and hauling water and standing very still against the walls of rooms where powerful men said things they should not have said in front of a servant they had decided was too dull to matter. She knew where every one of them kept their secrets. She had simply never had a way to spend what she knew. So when they came for her at the gray end of a winter afternoon, she was not surprised. The voiceless were the first to be spent when a spending was required. She had understood the shape of it for days, the way she understood most things, by listening. There was a young king now in Vale Keep, and the young king had a beast in him that no one had yet seen loosed. His enemies wanted it loosed. If the great wolf below the keep would tear apart a harmless girl who could not even beg for her life, then all of Dusk March would know the king was a monster kept on a fraying leash. And if the wolf would not, if it turned up its nose at the offering laid before it, then the king had no true beast at all, and a king with no beast was a king who could be pulled down. Either way, the men of House Kest would win the throw. All they needed was an offering no one would miss. They needed her. Grail, the warden of the pit, did not meet her eyes as he bound her wrists. He was not a cruel man, only a tired one, and tired men do the cruelest work because they have stopped arguing with it. "It is nothing personal, girl," he said, which is what men always say when a thing is as personal as a thing can be. Neve looked at him until he had to look away, and that was the only answer she had ever been able to give anyone, and she gave it to him then. They led her down. The stair went under the keep and kept going, past the wine and the cold rooms and the old dark where the stone wept, down to a door of black iron that had been shut so long it had grown a skin of frost. This was the undercage. The men who worked the winch would not stand near it. They lowered her through the grate into the dark and drew the grate shut over her head, and their torchlight climbed the stair and left, and Neve stood at the bottom of the world in a silence. Even she found loud. Something in the dark was breathing. She could not see it, but she could feel the size of it in the way the black moved, the way warmth rolled off it in slow waves, the way the floor seemed to lean toward the great, slow drum of its heart. It rose. She heard the whisper of an enormous body uncoiling, the click of claws on wet stone, the low working of breath as it took her scent and turned it over. She did not run. There was nowhere to run to, and she had learned long ago that running only teaches a hunting thing that you are prey. She stood, and she let it come, and she lifted her bound hands the small distance she could and turned the palms outward in the dark, which was all the surrender and all the greeting she had. The breathing stopped a hand's breadth from her face. She felt the heat of it on her cheek, felt the enormous nearness of teeth. She closed her eyes, and the beast lay down. It did not tear her. It did not so much as touch her with its teeth. It lowered its vast weight to the wet stone at her feet. And then, when she did not move, it did a thing that made no sense at all in a pit built for killing. It leaned the great warm wall of its body against her legs, and it stayed, so that the cold could not reach her from that side, and it kept the dark off her the whole night through, as though the two of them had agreed on something she had not been present to hear. Neve sank down against it because her legs would hold her no longer, and because it was warm, and because she was so tired of being afraid. Once, deep in the night, she woke and laid one careful hand flat against the great slow rise and fall of its side, half certain the whole thing was a dream that would end in teeth. The beast only breathed and let her hand stay, and after a while the drum of its heart slowed her own. Some hour before morning she slept, her cheek against a killing thing that had decided, for reasons of its own, not to kill her. Above, they waited for the sounds. When the sounds did not come, they told one another it was only a matter of time. When the gray of morning finally sent one thin blade of light down the stair, and still no sounds had come, the waiting turned to something colder. It was Grail who worked the winch at dawn, expecting to draw up what the pit always gave back, which was nothing anyone would want to look at. What the light showed him instead stopped his hands on the crank. The girl was alive. The girl was asleep. And curled around her like a mountain that had chosen to be gentle was the largest wolf he had ever seen. Its pale eyes already open, already fixed on him, telling him without a sound and with perfect clarity that if he touched the winch again, it would be the last thing his hands ever did. Grail took his hands off the winch. By the time the keep was awake, the story was running ahead of the truth, the way stories do. The offering had not been taken. The beast had refused. No, worse, the beast had kept her. Along the cold back stairs, the underservants who had known Neve as the quiet one passed the tale mouth to mouth in a hush. A kitchen boy named Wick, who had once slipped her half a loaf on a night she had gone without, heard it and grinned so wide his face hurt. Everywhere else in Vale Keep, the same news landed cold and heavy as a stone dropped down a well. And while the lords of House Kest stood in the cold hall working out how a throw they could not lose had somehow been lost, the wolf below the keep rose and shook itself and changed. Neve woke to the weight beside her shifting, to fur becoming skin and bulk becoming a man, and she found herself sitting at the bottom of the undercage beside the Alpha King of Duskmarch, who was looking at her with an expression she had no name for, because no one had ever aimed it at her before. He did not speak. He reached out slowly, the way a person reaches towards something they are afraid will bolt, and he untied the cord from her wrists, and he chafed the feeling back into her cold hands between his warm ones, and he watched her face the entire time as though her face were saying a great many things, and as though he could hear every one. That was the first strangeness. Everyone else in her life had needed her to have a voice, before they would grant that she had thoughts. This man sat in the freezing dark and read her like a page. They brought her up. He would not let them carry her, and he would not let them chain her. And when a chamberlain began to say something about custom, and about what was owed, the king said one word, "No," in a voice so quiet the man went white, and that was the end of custom. She was given a room, a real room, with a bed and a hearth, and a door of good oak. She stood in the middle of it, not knowing what to do with so much space that was, for the moment, only hers. And when the keep looked for the king that morning to demand an accounting, they found him where no one expected to find a king. He was sitting in the corridor outside the mute girl's chamber, his back against her door, letting no one past. He had killed nothing. He had claimed her. By morning, the Alpha King of Duskmarch was guarding her door, and no living soul could tell you why. The council could tell you what it wanted, which was not the same thing. They came to him before the noon bell, all of them, House Kest at the front with their faces arranged into concern. The offering had been made and refused, they said, and a refused offering was an ill omen that must be set right. The girl should be put out beyond the walls, or given quietly back to the pit by night, when the beast was elsewhere. It was for the good of Duskmarch. It was tradition. It was, they did not quite say, the only way left to salvage a plan that had turned in their hands. Neve was made to stand in the great hall while they discussed the disposal of her, as though she were a shipment of the wrong grain. She had stood in that hall 100 times with a pitcher in her hands, invisible. It was a strange and terrible thing to stand in it now, as the subject of the sentence, still invisible, still voiceless, while men who had never learned her name decided how she would end. She kept her eyes on the king. He let them talk. He had a gift for letting men talk. She was learning. A way of leaning back in the great chair with his chin on his hand and his pale eyes half-lidded that fooled clever men into believing he was not really listening, right up until the moment he showed them how completely he had been. When at last the eldest of House Kest, a silver lord named Halden with a voice like poured honey, finished explaining why she must die, the king was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She is mine now." The hall went still. The pit did not refuse her. He went on, unhurried. The pit chose her. You laid an offering at my feet, my lords, and I have decided to keep it. You will find there is no tradition older than that. He smiled, and the smile did not reach the cold of his eyes. Unless one of you would care to go down and explain to the beast that it chose wrongly. No one cared to. But Neve was watching Lord Halden's honeyed face while the king spoke, and she saw the thing pass across it that no one else was placed to see, a flicker of pure calculation, quickly smoothed. He was not defeated. He was adjusting. He wore the face of a man who has just learned something useful about his opponent, and means to spend it. And so it was done, in the space of a single sentence, with no ceremony and no consent from the only person it truly concerned. Neve went from a body to be disposed of to a possession of the crown, which was, she understood even then, only a better cage with a warmer floor. She was not free. She had simply been claimed by a larger hand than the one that had thrown her down. She should have been grateful. She was not sure what she was. It was Wick who brought her supper. Red to the ears at being sent to wait on a girl he had shared backstairs with a day before. He set the tray down and could not think what to say, so he said nothing, which was the rightest thing anyone had said to her in years. Then, in the doorway, he turned back. "I always knew you weren't simple," he mumbled, fierce and quick, and was gone before she could shape any answer. Neve sat with the warm bowl in her 2 hands and found that her eyes had filled, a thing she almost never let them do. Because there was a thing under all of it she could not make sit still, and Neve had never in her life been able to let a thing that would not sit still alone. He had not looked at her once during the whole of it, not while he claimed her, not while he silenced a room on her behalf. He had looked only at House Kest, and he had looked at them the way she looked at men who did not know she was listening. She knew that look. She wore that look. It was the look of someone who was not saving you at all, but rather using the saving of you to watch what your enemies did when they thought the game was lost. The king had not kept her because a beast had curled around her in the dark. Or not only for that. He had kept her because keeping her did something, moved something, forced a hand somewhere she could not yet see. She was a piece on a board. She simply did not yet know whose. That evening, a woman came to her chamber without knocking, tall and gray and richly dressed, with rings on every finger and a smile she had clearly practiced in a glass. "You poor silent creature," the woman said, settling herself uninvited by the fire as though the room were already hers. "They have thrown you into the middle of the Lord's war and left you with no way to speak for yourself. How fortunate that I have made a lifetime study of speaking for those who cannot. My name is Vara. At court, they call me the voice keeper." She reached out and tilted Neve's chin up with one cool ringed finger, studying her the way a buyer studies a horse. "From this day, little one, whatever you would say, you will say through me." Neve looked at the woman's smiling mouth and her hard, measuring eyes, and every silent instinct she owned went cold and still at once. The voice keeper moved into the chamber beside Neve's before the week was out, and set about the work of owning her. It was done gently, which was how Vara did everything. She chose Neve's gowns and named Neve's moods, and answered every question anyone thought to ask her, so that within days the court had stopped looking at Neve's face at all when they wished to know her mind. They looked at Vara, and Vara told them what the silent girl felt, and the silent girl stood beside her own answers like a guest at a table she had not been asked to sit at. Neve understood the trick of it perfectly. A voiceless creature who is spoken for by another has not been given a voice. She has been given a leash with a softer collar. And Vara's translations, she began to notice, all leaned the same way. When a lord of House Kest passed them in the gallery, and Neve went stiff with the memory of a bound wrist and a black grate, Vara laughed lightly and assured the man that the dear child bore no grudge and held nothing against those who had merely done their duty. Neve held a very great deal against them, but her fear had been folded up and handed back to the court as forgiveness, and she could only stand inside the lie and wear it like her own skin. The king saw it before Neve would have guessed he could. It happened over nothing. He had come to the small East Solar where she was kept in the afternoons, as he had taken to coming, and he asked her, plainly, whether the room suited her or whether she would rather be given one that faced the water. It was a small kindness and a real question. And before Neve could so much as turn her head, Vara answered for her, smooth as poured cream, saying that the poor creature was more than content, and wished only to trouble no one and to serve his majesty in grateful silence. Neve had wished no such thing. She had in fact been about to point at the window because she had spent 19 years without ever once sleeping where she could see the sky. The king did not look at Vara. He looked at Neve, and he watched something cross her face, some small flinch of contradiction she had not meant to let show, and his pale eyes sharpened with interest. "Leave us," he said to the voice keeper. Vara's smile did not slip, which told Neve a great deal about how well practiced it was. She rose and made her courtesy, and went, and only at the door did she glance back. One cool, unreadable look thrown across the room like a line paying out, and then she was gone. The king crossed to a writing desk that stood against the wall. He took up a leaf of paper and a stick of pressed charcoal, and he set them on the low table before Neve, and then he did a thing no one in the whole of her life had done. He sat down across from her, and he waited. Neve looked at the paper. She looked at him. Her heart was going very hard, because here was the danger she had spent years keeping folded up small. A mute who cannot read is a simple thing, harmless, pitied, ignored. A mute who can read and write is a witness. She had taught herself letters in the muniment room over long forgotten winters, hidden among ledgers no one thought a dull girl could understand, and she had never let a living soul learn it, because a servant who could set down what she had seen was a servant with something worth taking her hands for. And now the most dangerous man in Duskmarch was sitting very still, holding out a charcoal, telling her without a word that he already knew. She could deny it. She could stare at the paper the way a simple girl would, and let him decide he had guessed wrong. It would be the safe thing. It would also be the last time anyone ever again offered her a way to answer for herself. Neve picked up the charcoal. Her hand was not quite steady. In small, careful letters, the letters of a person who has never once been allowed to be clumsy, she wrote a single word. Water. The king read it. Then he smiled, and it was not the cold court smile he had worn in the hall, nor the lazy one he gave the lords. It was small and surprised and unguarded, and it changed his whole face, and Neve felt it land somewhere under her ribs where she had no defenses built. Water it is, he said quietly. You shall have the sky. He did not take the paper away and end it there, as she had braced for. He leaned back and asked her another question, an ordinary one, whether she found the court much changed now that she stood in it rather than against its walls. And Neve, with a lifetime damned behind her teeth and the first crack the dam had ever known, wrote that the court had not changed at all, only that she now stood where the wine was poured instead of where it was carried, and from here she could see it was the same men spilling it. He laughed, once, low and startled. A real laugh with no chord in it, and looked at her as though a chair he had been kind to had turned and made an observation about the room. "You are not what they threw down that pit," he said. She was not. She had only never before been asked. He turned the paper over in his fingers as he rose, her words facing up, and for just a moment she saw him look at it, not as a man looks at a gift, but as a man looks at a key he has been searching a long time to find. Then it was gone, folded away into his coat, and he was only smiling again. She should have run from it. Instead, she found, over the slow, bright weeks that followed, that she was walking toward it with her eyes open. He came to the East Solar most days now. He brought the paper himself and would not let Vara near it, and he learned her the way no one had ever troubled to learn her, not with grand gestures, but with attention, which is the rarer thing. He learned that she tilted her head a certain way when she thought he was being a fool and meant to be told so on paper. He learned that she went still, not blank, but bright and gathering, when something interested her. He learned to leave silences open long enough for her to fill them, which meant he was the first person she had ever met who let her finish a thought. The wolf under her skin, quiet all her life, had begun to stir when he was near, turning toward him like a plant toward a window, and she did not know what that meant and was afraid to learn. But Neve had not survived 19 years by letting her heart tell her eyes what to see, and her eyes had begun to keep a second account. There were moments in those weeks she knew she would keep until she was old. The morning he brought her not paper, but a whole-bound book of blank leaves, sewn for her alone, so that her words need no longer be burned in a grate when the day was done. The evening she wrote something sharp about a preening envoy, and he had to press his knuckles to his mouth and turn to the window so the man would not see his king laughing at him. Small things. They did not feel small. Each one was a coin laid down in a life that had never before been paid in anything at all. But he asked her things too. Small things, folded so cleverly into the warmth that she nearly missed the shape of them. Which lords had she served at table? Whose rooms had she cleaned in the old wing? Had she ever, in all her quiet years against the walls, seen the late steward take a certain private stair, and who had gone up it after him? Once she caught the pattern whole. She had written him a long, idle answer about the old wing, and his eyes had moved down her lines and stopped, sharp and hungry, on exactly one name among the many, and moved on again too smoothly, and she understood in that instant that everything before and after that name had been chaff, and that name had been the harvest. They were the questions of a man courting a woman for her memory, and Neve, who had spent her life being underestimated, knew this was its exact and dangerous opposite. He was not overlooking what she knew. He was mining it. She simply could not yet tell whether the warmth was the ore or only the shaft dug down to reach it. Then someone tried to kill him, and for one endless moment the question stopped mattering at all. It was on the north walls at dusk. She was 3 steps behind him, as she was often now, and the wolf in her felt it before her eyes did, a wrongness sliding along the parapet, a coldness where a warm body should not have been. She had no way to shout. In the whole of the world, there is perhaps nothing crueler than to see death coming for the one person you would spend your voice to save, and to have no voice to spend. So Neve spent the only thing she had. She threw herself into him. The bolt that would have gone through his throat struck her through the shoulder instead, and drove them both down against the cold stone, and the world became noise and running men and blood she was distantly surprised to find was her own. He caught her as she fell. He was shouting for the guard and shielding her body with his, and pressing his own hand to her shoulder to stop the dark spreading all at once, and his face above her had gone white to the lips, and there was nothing calculated in it anywhere. Whatever else was a lie, that was not. She held to that as the edges of things went soft. She had never in her life seen anyone frightened for her. It was, she thought dimly, a strange thing to receive for the first time while bleeding on cold stone, and stranger still that it should feel, under the pain, so much like being warm. "Stay," he was saying, over and over, low and cracked, a king reduced to a single word. "Stay with me, Neve, stay." And even then, even with the bolt in her and his blood mixed with hers, some cold clerk in the back of her mind wrote down the thing she did not want to know. He had asked her, only that morning, whether she would know the archer's face if she saw it again. Almost as if he had been expecting one. She did not die, though the fever tried for 3 days to argue the point. And when at last it broke, she woke to find him asleep in the chair beside her bed, which is not where kings sleep. After that, something in the keep changed its shape. He would not have her hidden any longer. When she could stand, he brought her out before the whole court at the feast of the first frost, and he did not present her as a rescued servant or a curiosity of the pit. He stood her at his own right hand, where his queen would stand, and he told the assembled lords of Duskmarch that the silent girl they had thrown away had put her body between their king and a traitor's bolt, and that any man who looked at her again as though she were nothing would answer to him for it. Neve stood in the light of 100 candles and felt the eyes of the room move over her and find, for the first time in her life, that they could not dismiss what they saw. It was a giddy, unfamiliar thing, to be looked at and not looked past, and she let herself have it, because she had gone 19 years without, and did not know when it might be taken again. Wick, serving wine along the low tables, caught her eye and went so red with fierce joy she nearly laughed aloud, which for her would have been a silence with a smile in it. She marked the 2 faces that did not join the warmth. Lord Halden of House Kest raised his cup to her along with the rest, and smiled. And the smile was a lovely thing, and behind it his eyes did the small, cold arithmetic of a man recalculating a sum that would not come right. And Vara, seated lower than she was used to sitting now that the king spoke to Neve without her, watched the girl who no longer needed a keeper for her voice, and watched the paper the king had begun to carry in his coat, and did not drink at all. Later, when the feast had thinned, he took her out to the high gallery where the frost had put its first white edge on the stone, and for a while neither of them tried to fill the quiet, which between them had stopped being an absence and become a place they could both stand in. "They gave you to a monster," he said at last, not looking at her, looking out over the dark of his own kingdom. "That is the story they tell, the beast in the pit. And the truth is, I have spent my whole life being afraid they are right, that underneath the smiling there is only teeth." He was quiet a moment. "My father wore the smile so well that no one ever knew the teeth were in it until they closed. I learned the smile from him before I understood what it was for. And now I stand up here, and I cannot always tell, myself, where the ruler ends and the animal begins, or whether there was ever a plain man in between it all." He turned to her then, and the easy king was gone, and what stood in his place looked young and tired, and wholly without armor. "You lay down beside the beast in the dark, and you were not afraid of it. Everyone else in my life has been afraid of me since the day I was crowned. I have wanted, ever since that pit, to ask you how you did it." Neve had no paper, so she did the only thing left to her. She reached up and laid her palm flat against his chest, over the hard, frightened drum of his heart, the way she had laid it against the beast's side that first night in the pit. And she held it there, and she looked at him, and let her face say the thing she could not write, which was that she had felt the same fear in the animal and in the man, and had not run from either. Something broke open behind his eyes. He caught her hand and pressed it harder to him, as though he could not bear to let it go, and then he kissed her. And it was nothing like the practiced ease of the court. It was grateful and undone and a little desperate, and the wolf in her rose to meet it, and she stopped, for one clean and dangerous moment, keeping any account at all. Let us pause here a breath. If Neve's story has its hand around your heart the way it has around mine, and you would like to be here when it ends, subscribe before we go on. It costs you nothing, and it is the one small voice she cannot ask you for herself. She did not see the folded paper slip from his coat as he drew her close. She did not see it fall, her one careful word turned up to the frost. But she felt, even in the middle of that kiss, some far cold part of her go quiet and watchful, as though it already knew that a thing this good was a debt, and that the accounting was coming. She found it out the way she found out most things, by being somewhere no one had thought to account for her. She had gone down to the muniment room at the gray hour before the keep woke, the way a person returns to the one place that has ever been theirs. It was where she had taught herself to be more than they thought her, among the ledgers and the dust, and she had not been back since the pit. She wanted an hour with the smell of old paper and no one reading her face. What she found instead was lamplight under the door that should have been dark, and the king inside it, bent over the long table, and her own blank book open beside his hand. He was not reading it as a lover reads. He had her written weeks spread out around him, page beside page, and beside them the household ledgers of the old wing, and a chart in his own hand with names and dates and one private stair drawn out in ink. And he was moving between her words and the record with a pen, joining them, the way a man builds a wall from stones he has been gathering a long time. She saw her own small, careful hand underlined in 3 places. She saw a name she had given him once, buried in an idle answer about who carried keys, circled twice and joined by a line to the date her whole world had ended 11 years ago. She stood in the doorway and watched her entire self be taken apart and used. And she understood everything at once, the way she always did, too late and all together. He looked up and saw her, and for the first time since the pit, she watched the king be afraid. She did not have her book. She had nothing to write with, and nowhere to write. And so she asked him the only way left, with her open hands and her still face, and every hard year of learning to make silence speak. "What is this?" "Neve," he said, and set the pen down too carefully. "Let me tell you all of it. I should have told you before now. I know that." She did not move. She let the not moving be her whole reply. And so he told her, standing behind the table with the evidence of himself between them. His father, the old king, had not died of the wasting sickness the realm had been told. He had been poisoned, slowly, over a season, by a hand inside his own house, and the young man who inherited the crown had known it in his bones and been able to prove none of it. For 3 years he had hunted the truth through a keep full of people paid to forget, and every trail had died at the same wall, because the only ones who ever saw anything were the ones no one counted. The servants, the silent ones, the ones who stood against the walls and were spoken over. And then, he said, very low, my enemies threw the one servant who had seen the most into my pit to be rid of her. And the beast in me knew her before I did. I told myself that was all it was. I told myself I kept you because the wolf chose you, because you were brave in the dark, because I could not stop wanting to be near you. He stopped. But I also kept you because you cleaned the old wing the winter my father died, because you were there, because you are the last living person who might have seen the face on that stair. And I have spent every hour since courting the one thing I could not take by force, which was what is in your head. The cold clerk in her, the one that kept the second account, laid down its pen. It had been right. It was always right. That was the worst of it. Every warm hour rearranged itself behind her eyes into a colder shape. The paper. The blank book sewn for her alone. The patience, the attention, the way he let her finish a thought. She had believed a king had troubled to learn her, and a king had. The way a man learns the lock he means to open. She made herself ask it, hands shaking now, the shapes clumsy. Did you ever? Any of it? Was any of it? All of it, he said, and his voice broke on the word, and she hated that it sounded true. The using and the loving both, at the same time, until I could not tell my own hands apart. That is not an excuse. I know what I did. I made you believe you were finally seen, and I was reading you the whole while. She waited. She gave him the silence she had given Grail, the silence that was the only sentence she had ever been able to pass, and she waited to see which word he would reach for. A better man might have said he was sorry. A braver one might have said he would let her go. What the king said, low and desperate, was, "Without you, I cannot prove it. You are the only proof left alive." Proof. He had said proof. She took up her book from among his papers, and turned, and walked out. And behind her she heard him say her name once, and then, to his lasting credit or his lasting shame, he did not follow. And as she went, she shut the bond, the warm, patient thread that had been opening in her all these weeks. Shut it hard, the way you shut a door on a fire so it will die for want of air. It did not die. It only banked itself low and went on burning where she could not reach it, which was somehow worse, a warmth she now knew the price of and could not put down. She did not weep on the stair. She had never had the luxury of weeping where it could be used against her, and old habits do not leave a person even on a night that has taken everything. She only walked, down through the cold keep, hollow as a struck bell, cataloguing in the ruthless clerk's part of her mind the thing she did not yet want to face. She was not merely a heartbroken girl now. She was a witness who had quarreled with the king, and a witness who has quarreled with the king is a witness no one on the other side can afford to leave breathing. She had walked out of the one pair of hands in Dusk March strong enough to keep her alive, and into the open, alone, carrying the single fact that powerful people had already killed once to bury. She had no idea how little time she had before they came to bury it again. Grief, she discovered, was a room with only one door, and Vara was already standing in it when Neve got there. "Oh, my poor silent lamb," the voice keeper said, rising from the chair by Neve's cold hearth, where she had let herself in and made herself at home. "I did try to warn you. Did I not say the great ones only ever want us for what we carry? I have been used by kings since before you were born, child. Come, sit. Let Vara look after you now." And for one low hour Neve let her, because she was too hollowed out to do otherwise, and because a lifetime of being managed does not leave you all at once. Vara brought wine. Neve did not drink, and stroked her hair and talked, in that low, unhurried voice. She told Neve she had seen it 100 times, the great ones who take a girl up and set her down again, and that a wise girl learned to carry her own worth somewhere. No king could reach it. It was, Neve thought distantly, almost kind. It was so nearly kind that she understood exactly how 30 years of it had worked. It was in the talking that Vara made her single mistake, the mistake of the clever who have decided you are simple. "You must let me take you away from all of this," Vara murmured. "Tonight. Quietly. I have friends who value a discreet girl. You will give me that little book of yours to keep safe, and anything else you have carried out of the old days, and I will see you settled somewhere no king can trouble you again." Her ringed fingers smoothed and smoothed. It is a terrible thing, is it not, to have seen what we have seen? Better to hand it to someone who knows what it is worth. I always did know what it was worth. Neve went very still. because in her memory a door opened that she had kept shut for 11 years, the way she had kept the bond shut, out of a child's animal sense that some things must not be looked at directly. The winter the old king died. She had been 8 years old and small enough to be furniture, sent down with a bucket to the old wing that no one used, and she had heard feet on the private stair in the dark, and pressed herself into a doorway out of the habit of the unwanted. She had seen the old king's own physician come down that stair with his bag, quick and grave-faced, and she had seen the person waiting for him at the bottom to take the empty vial from his hand and press coin into his palm. She had seen the rings catch the one candle. She had seen the smile. She had not known, at 8, what a vial and a coin and a grave face on a private stair added up to. She had only known, the way children know, that she had seen a thing she was not meant to survive seeing, and she had gone very quiet. And being quiet was the one thing she had always been able to do. It had not been Halden on the stair that night. Halden had been the purse. Vara had been the hand. Neve lifted her eyes to the smiling woman who had built a whole life out of speaking for those who could not, and understood at last why. It was not mercy, it was control. Who better to bury what the voiceless had seen than the one person the court trusted to say what the voiceless meant? Vara had not attached herself to Neve out of pity. She had done it the moment the beast kept the girl alive, because a living witness with a king's ear was the one loose thread that could hang her, and she had spent these weeks with her hand on Neve's voice for exactly the reason a jailer keeps the only key. Every soft correction, every gentle answer given in Neve's name had been a stitch sewn over her mouth. The voice keeper did not speak for the voiceless. She spoke over them, so that the things they knew died in the room with them. The voice keeper saw the knowledge arrive in Neve's face. She was too old and too practiced to gasp. She simply set down the wine, and her smile did not slip, and her eyes went flat and calculating, and she said gently, "You cannot even say it, you know. That is the beauty of you, lamb. You have never once been able to say a single thing you know. Whatever noise you make, it is I who will tell them what it meant. I always have." Neve stood. She was shaking, but not with fear now. She reached down and took up her blank book from the table, the book the king had given her, and she held it against her chest where Vara could not reach it. And she looked at the woman who had owned her voice, and she refused, with her whole silent body, to hand it over. It was the first thing in her life she had ever refused anyone out loud, and she had made no sound at all. And for the first time in 30 years of managing the silent, Vara found she could not read the meaning off a mute girl's face, because the meaning was contempt, and no one had ever aimed that at her before. "Foolish," Vara breathed, and rose and gathered her skirts. And at the door she paused and let the mask come the rest of the way off. "There are quieter pits than the king's, child, for girls who cannot scream in them. You should have taken the wine." She looked Neve over one last time, a buyer appraising a horse that had shown its teeth. "You think the little book saves you. A page can be burned, and a witness can be lost on a dark road. And who, in all of Duskmarch, will ever miss a mute servant the king has grown tired of? No one will speak for you, lamb. No one ever has, but me." Then she was gone, and the door clicked shut behind her, soft as everything Vara did. And Neve stood alone in the cold room holding the only proof left alive, hunted now by the purse and the hand alike, with the one man who could have protected her shut out behind a door she had closed with her own hands. Vara was wrong about one thing, though, and Neve held it in the dark like a coal. No one had ever spoken for her, true. But no one had ever needed to. She had listened from the walls of this keep for 19 years, and there was little that happened in it she had not seen, and less she had ever forgotten. And a person the powerful have spent their whole lives underestimating is holding a loaded thing they never think to take away, because they have never once believed it was there. For 11 days after that, she waited to be killed, and instead, she was courted, which was worse, because it required her to keep deciding. The king did not send Vara. He did not send guards to take what was in her head, though every hour that Neve stayed silent was an hour his father's murderers walked free, and she knew what that restraint was costing him, and she hated that she could measure it. Instead, he did the one thing that made no sense in a man who needed her, and every kind of sense in a man who loved her against his own advantage. He set her free. The papers came by Wick's careful hands. She was no longer a possession of the crown. She was a free woman of Duskmarch, with a name entered in the roll, and a small income settled on her that no king could revoke, and a room with a good door, and a key that was hers. And beneath it all, in the king's own plain hand, one line: "You are not a piece on anyone's board. You never were. I am sorry it took me until I had lost you to say so. Sorry." He had found the word at last, now that it could buy him nothing. She read the papers twice and then a third time, because she had never in her life held a document that made her the owner of herself rather than the property in the margin. And she did not entirely know what a person was supposed to feel, holding such a thing from the hand that had wronged her. She felt mostly that it was too late, and that it was the truest thing he had ever given her, and that both of those were real at once, and would not resolve, the way his using and his loving would not resolve. He courted her after that the only honest way left to him, which was in her own language, and Neve was not prepared for what it did to her. He learned her signs. The king of Duskmarch, who had a realm bleeding and a council turning against him, and a witness who would not speak, spent his stolen hours learning the hand speech of the deaf almshouse in the lower city, badly at first and then less badly, so that he could come and stand in her doorway and say, clumsily, with those blunt swordsman's hands, "I am here. No paper between us. I will wait." She watched him fumble a sign 3 times over and get it wrong 3 times and try a fourth. This man before whom lords went pale, made a beginner and a fool in the tongue of scullery maids and almshouse children. For her, and something in her chest that she was fighting very hard turned over, and would not lie still. The most powerful man in the land had made himself mute, so that he could speak to her on the only ground where she had always been fluent, and he had always been dumb. She did not answer him. But she did not close the door either, and they both knew what that cost her, and what it did not yet mean. She might have held out longer. She would never know. Because on the 11th night, Halden stopped waiting. They came for her in the dark, as Vara had promised. 4 men with soft boots and a cloth and a short blade, sent to make the loose thread into a silence no one could read. Neve woke to the wolf in her screaming and a hand across her mouth that did not need to be there, and she fought the way the voiceless learn to fight, low and dirty and without a sound. She drove an elbow into a throat and a knee, where it would fold a man, and she reached for the little knife she now kept, and laid open a reaching hand before they pinned it, and none of it made a whisper, because she had no whisper to make. And a girl fighting for her life in perfect silence is a strange and awful thing, like drowning behind glass. It would not have been enough. 4 to 1 in the dark, with a cloth already at her face, it would not have been nearly enough. But the beast had been guarding her door. She had not known. All 11 nights, while the man waited in her doorway by day, the wolf had lain across her threshold by dark, unasked, unthanked, keeping the black off her the way it had in the pit. It came through the door now not as a man learning gentle signs, but as the thing the whole realm had thrown a girl into a pit to see loosed, and in the close dark of that little room it was terrible, and it was entirely on her side. There was a sound she would not describe to herself afterward, and then a worse quiet, and then only her own heart and the great bellows of its breathing. She pressed herself to the wall and shut her eyes and did not, this time, feel any fear of it at all. The monster they had all been so afraid of had turned out to be the only thing in Duskmarch that had never once wanted a single thing from her but to keep her alive. When it was over, the king knelt in the wreckage in his own skin, gasping. A blade's line opened along his ribs where the last man had reached him, and he looked at her to see that she was whole before he looked at anything else, before he looked at his own blood. And Neve, who had shut the bond and meant to keep it shut, felt it blow open in her like a door in a storm, because you cannot watch a thing nearly die for you and stay behind a door. He did not press his advantage. He got to his feet, holding his side, and he told her the rest in his broken hand speech and his cracking voice together. Halden had forced it into the open at last. Come the morning, the lords of Duskmarch would sit in judgment, and Halden would stand before them and lay his own crime at the king's feet, the poisoning of the old king, turned inside out, the son accused of murdering the father to seize the crown. Vara would bring forward servants she had spent years teaching to say what she meant, and she would translate for them. And the young king's word alone would not be enough to stand against it. He would fall. His father's murderers would have the throne. I will not name you in that hall, he signed, the shape slow and certain through the pain. You did not ask to hold my life. I put you in a cage once already. I will not put you in the witness box to save myself. If I fall, I fall. You are free. That is the one thing I have left that I gave you clean. And he bowed to her, the king to the mute Omega, and turned to go and meet his judgment alone. Neve stood in the ruined dark, with the bond wide open and the whole terrible truth sitting in her hands, the truth she alone was alive to tell, and had sworn she would never be made to tell, and she understood that no one was going to make her. That was the trap, and the gift of it. He had left the choosing entirely to her, and in leaving it, he had done the one thing that could reach a person who had been chosen for and decided for and spent her entire life. He had made her the only author of what came next. She thought of a child of 8 with a bucket on a dark stair, who had seen a thing she was not meant to survive and had survived it by going quiet. She thought of 11 years of carrying that thing too heavy to say, up and down these same cold stairs, invisible, waiting for a way to set it down. She thought of every clever, powerful person who had ever stood in a bright room and built their plans on the flat certainty that the silent girl in the corner would stay silent because she had no choice. And she thought, with a cold, clean fury that felt almost exactly like joy, that they had all made the same mistake, from Grail at the winch, to Halden in his grey, to Vara, with her rings. Every one of them, her whole life long. They had confused a girl who could not speak with a girl who had nothing to say. She reached out and caught his sleeve. The great hall had been full the morning they discussed her disposal like the wrong grain. It was fuller now. Every lord of Duskmarch had come to see a king unmade. Halden stood at the center of the floor in his finest gray, grave and sorrowful, a man performing the heavy duty of truth, and beside him stood Vara with her rings and her practiced grief, and ranged behind them a little row of frightened servants with their eyes on the floor, the voiceless and the near enough to it, gathered to say through the voice-keeper whatever the voice-keeper had taught them to mean. It was, Neve had to grant, a beautiful machine. It had been built to run on silence. It had never once been tested against a silence that had decided to speak. Halden spoke well. He always spoke well. He wept, a little, for the old king so cruelly poisoned, and let the grief hang in the hall. And then he turned it, gently, terribly, toward the young man on the high seat. Who had gained a crown by that death? Who kept a beast in a pit and loosed it on men in the dark? Who had let a mute servant turn his head, and then set his monster on the very lords who came to counsel him? He did not accuse. He was far too skilled to accuse. He merely grieved out loud in a shape that left only one conclusion standing when he had finished, and one by one Neve watched the faces of the lords settle into it. The king stood alone before the high seats and did not defend himself well, because he had spent his defense keeping one promise, and Neve watched him take the blows of Haldan's grief and understood that he truly meant to fall rather than call her name. He said he had not killed his father. He said it plainly once, a king's flat word. And a king's flat word was precisely the thing Haldan had spent an hour making worthless. He did not say the rest. He did not say that a silent girl 3 rows back could end it in a breath, because he had promised her she would never again be spent for someone else's purpose. And he was, Neve understood with a terrible swelling in her chest, going to keep that promise all the way down into the dark. So she did not wait to be called. She walked out of the crowd and into the open floor, and a mutter went through the hall. The mute girl, the pit girl, and Haldan turned with his sorrowful face and made the single error that House Kest had been making since the day they threw her down. He was not afraid of her. Why would he be? She had no voice. Vara moved at once to stand at Neve's side, smooth and swift, laying one ringed hand upon her shoulder, turning to the lords with the warm, sad smile of a woman who would now, kindly, tell them what the poor, silent creature wished to say. It was the whole of her power, that gesture. It was 30 years of owning the meaning of everyone who could not argue. Neve took the hand off her shoulder and stepped away from it, in front of them all. Then she did the thing no one in that hall had prepared for, because no one in that hall had ever thought her a person who could. She turned to the long table where the clerks recorded the judgments of the realm, and she took up a clerk's pen, and she took up a broad, clean sheet, and in letters large enough for the front benches to read, she began to write. And Wick, gods keep him, understood before anyone else, and darted forward to lift each sheet as she filled it and carry it down the rows, so the lords could see it with their own eyes, so that no one would need Vara to tell them what the silent girl meant. She wrote what she had seen, and she wrote it plainly, in the short, flat sentences of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning that the fewer the words, the harder they were to twist. The winter of the old kings dying. A girl of 8 with a bucket in the old wing where no one went. The physician on the private stair in the dark, gray-faced, his bag in his hand. The empty vial passed down. And the woman waiting at the bottom of the stair to take it. The woman with a ring on every finger, who had pressed the coin into the physician's hand and smiled, and whose smile Neve had carried behind her teeth for 11 years because she had never before had a way to spend it. Sheet after sheet went down the rows, and the hall read them in a silence that grew and grew, and the thing Neve had never once been permitted happened at last, which was a room full of powerful people taking the meaning of her life directly from her own hand, with no one standing between. The hall had gone silent in a wholly new way. Vara laughed, or tried to, and moved smoothly to the center of the floor, spreading her hands, and began to say what she had said 1,000 times to 1,000 rooms, that the poor child was confused, that grief and a jealous heart had turned her, that a mute girl's frightened scribbling was hardly testimony, and that she, who knew the creature's mind, could tell them what the girl truly meant. It was the oldest move she had, and it had never once failed, and Neve watched the lords begin, from long habit, to turn toward the smooth, sad voice for the answer. And Neve wrote one more line, and held it up herself this time, high, so the woman had to read it along with the room. I could not scream on the stair that night. So I picked up what your physician let fall. Then she reached into her bodice and drew out the thing she had carried since she was a child of 8, the thing she had kept through every hungry year when a scrap of silver might have fed her, because some animal part of her had always known she would need it one day to say what she could not. A physician's seal ring, small and cold, stamped with the Martin of House Kest, dropped on a dark stair by a hand that had been paid to reach too far. She set it down on the clerk's table in the enormous quiet, and it made, against the wood, the only sound she had ever managed to make in that hall, a small hard click, and it was louder than a scream. For a moment, nothing moved. The lord stared at the little ring as though it were a live coal on the wood. The old king's physician had vanished the season of the death, and here on the table was his seal, kept 11 years by the one witness everyone had been so careful to think an idiot, stamped with the badge of the very house that stood accused. It was the join in the king's long wall of evidence, the single stone he had never been able to find, and a mute girl had carried it against her heart the whole time. Halden lunged for it. He was fast for a silver lord, and for one breath his fingers were a hand's width from sweeping it off the table into the rushes where it might be lost, and 3 lords of the middle benches caught him and bore him back down, and the grave, sorrowful mask tore off him all at once, and what was underneath was only a cornered man, snarling, and every soul in the hall saw the grief turn out to have been a coat all along. And Vara, watching 30 years of owned silence come apart in the hands of the one girl she had been most careful to keep leashed, opened her mouth to speak for the whole room one last time, to pour the cream, to tell them what they had really seen, and she found, for the first time in her long-practiced life, that there was no one left in that hall who would take her word over the writing on the page. The lords were not looking at her mouth. They were reading Neve's hand, and a keeper of voices is nothing at all in a room that has learned to hear. They took Halden and the voice-keeper down through the keep to cells that did not open, and the realm began, slowly, to right itself the way a ship rights after the wave has passed. It took days. The old king's death was entered true in the roll at last, 11 years late. The servants Vara had drilled were questioned kindly, in their own tongues, by people the king now paid to listen rather than to translate, and their small buried truths came up one after another like held breath let go. Neve was at the center of all of it, and at rest in none of it, because a thing had been proved in that hall, and a thing between her and the king had not. He came to her on the 3rd evening, and he came the way she had never seen him come, without the ease, without the crown, in a plain coat like the traveler he had never truly been allowed to be. He stood in her doorway, the doorway the beast had guarded, and he did not cross it. He waited to be let in. This man who had once claimed her with a single word before a whole hall, and the waiting was itself the apology, the one he could not have made in the muniment room, because there it would have cost him the case, and now it cost him only his pride. For 3 days she had turned it over and been unable to make it lie flat. He had lied to her. He had also learned her language with his own clumsy hands, and freed her when he needed her most, and knelt in her wrecked room to see she was whole before he saw to his own blood. Both were true. All her life she had known only rooms where people were ever one thing: the cruel warden, the smiling keeper, the kind kitchen boy. And here was a person who was 2 things at once, and would not pretend otherwise, and she was beginning to suspect that was what loving a real person was, not the absence of the wound, the staying with the wound in plain view. "I owe you my life and my father's name," he signed slowly, the shape surer now from all his stolen practice. "I will not use either one to ask you for a single thing. I came only to say what I should have said in the muniment room when it would have cost me something to say it." She waited. She had grown very good at waiting, and he had grown at last into a man who did not rush to fill her silences. "I loved you before I knew you were the witness," he signed, "and when I learned what you were, I let myself pretend the loving and the using were the same thing, so I would not have to choose between them, so I could keep you and my honor both, and never once feel the join. That was the cowardice. not the keeping of you. The lie I told myself. He drew a breath, and his hands slowed. I have thought, these 3 days, about the pit. They threw you into a cage to be rid of you, and I told the hall I was better than they were. And the truth is, I built you a warmer one, and called it love, and hoped you would never test the door. You tested it. You were right too. He looked at her steadily. You have every right to walk out of this keep tonight and never look back. And if you do, I will guard the road you leave by, and I will not follow. And then he did the last thing, the thing that undid her, because it cost him the one armor he had left. He told her his name. Not the king's name that was stamped on the coins she used to count, the name a whole realm owned a piece of. The other one, the small private one his mother had used before the crown ate the rest of him, the one no one in Duskmarch had spoken aloud in years, the one he had never given even in the warm weeks when the giving would have won him something. Soren, he signed, and then, clumsily, said it too, his own name, out loud, handing her the only part of himself that had never belonged to the realm. When you decide about Soren, not the king. The king has no right to you and knows it, but Soren would like, more than he has ever wanted anything in a life spent wanting very little he was allowed to keep, to be forgiven. That is all. He has no gift left to offer that you do not already own outright. The bond was wide open between them, and it was not a leash, and it was not a cage. It was only the truth, the warm, patient thread she had tried and failed to starve, telling her what she had known on the north wall with the bolt in her, what she had known when he came through her door in his other skin and cared, before ever he saw to his own torn side, only whether she was hurt. She had spent her whole life being spoken for, and being spent, and being read like a page by people who wanted only what was written on it. This was the first person who had handed her the pen and then waited, with nothing held back and nothing held over her, to see what she would choose to write. She crossed the room. She took his blunt swordsman's hand in both of hers, the hand that had learned her language one painful sign at a time, and she turned it palm up and against it. With one finger, slowly, she wrote the shape of a single letter, and then another, spelling into his skin the first word she had ever given anyone entirely of her own free will. Stay. He bowed his head over her hands, and she felt the great shudder go through him, the king of all Duskmarch coming apart quietly in a plain coat in a servant's old room, and she felt the breath leave him as though he had been holding it for 11 years, or for the whole of his crowned and lonely life. He did not say thank you, and he did not say I love you, because both would have been too small, and he had finally learned the size of things. He only turned his caught hand over inside hers and held on, the way she had held to the beast in the pit on the first night of everything, warmth against warmth in the dark, two creatures who had each been taught to expect teeth and found, against all the plans of all the clever people above them, only this. And neither of them for a long while needed anything more said, by voice or hand or pen, in any language at all. There is a kind of quiet a story earns, and there is a kind it must go out and win in front of everyone. And Neve had one more of the second sort left to win. The lords of Duskmarch gathered a last time, not to unmake a king now, but to watch him do a thing kings do not do. Neve stood at the foot of the high seats where she had once been made to stand, and hear men decide how she would die, and the room looked at her, and did not look past her. And this time it was not the candles that held their eyes. She let herself feel it, standing there, the whole strange distance of it. Not long ago she had crossed this floor with a pitcher and been furniture. Then she had crossed it bound, to be disposed of like spoiled grain. Then bleeding, held up as the girl who took a bolt. And now she crossed it as herself, a free woman with her name in the roll and her own key in her pocket, and a truth in her hands that had toppled two of the oldest powers in the realm. and the same lords who had once decided she was too dull to matter inclined their heads as she passed. She did not gloat. She had known her worth her whole life. She had simply, at last, been given the room to spend it in. The king came down from the high seat. He did not sit above her. He came all the way down to the floor where she stood, to the level of the girl they had thrown in a pit, and he spoke so the whole hall would hear it, because some things owed a debt must be paid in public where the debt was made. You threw her into my cage, he said to them, to all of them, because you had decided she was nothing, and a nothing is a cheap thing to spend. And she lay down beside the worst of me in the dark and was not afraid, and she took a bolt meant for my throat, and she kept the truth of my father's murder locked in her silence for 11 years, and not one of you ever thought to ask a silent girl what she had seen. You built your whole treason on the certainty that she would never speak. He let that sit. You were wrong about the only thing that mattered. She was never silent. You were simply never worth listening to. There is a difference, my lords, and it has just cost the two proudest among you everything they had, and it should frighten the rest of you a great deal more than my beast ever did. He had that morning done the thing that made what came next true. The pits beneath the keep were struck from the law of Duskmarch, filled in with stone, so that no lord could ever again be rid of an inconvenient soul by feeding it to the dark. And the old office of the voice-keeper was struck down with them, root and branch, so that never again in that realm would the meaning of the voiceless be owned by another mouth. In its place he had set a plain new thing, unglamorous and hard to corrupt, a school in the lower city where the hand speech of the almshouse would be taught freely to any who wished to learn it, servant and lord alike, so that the silent might be answered directly and never again need a keeper to be understood. Every silent soul in the keep had been given, that day, the one thing Neve had been denied her whole life, which was the right to be asked and answered in their own tongue. So when he came to the last of it, he was not a jailer offering a kinder cell. He had emptied every cage he owned. He had given away, in a single morning, every lever a king had ever held over the powerless, and he had done it before he asked her, so that the asking would be clean. Only then, with every cage in his kingdom struck down behind him, did the king of all Duskmarch go down on one knee before a castless mute Omega, on the same stones where they had once weighed how best to be rid of her. It was not the pageant of a king being gracious. It was a man putting his open throat within reach of the one person alive who had earned the right to close it. I have no claim on you, he said, kneeling. I have made certain of it. I have given away every way I had to keep you. So there is nothing left to do it with but this. And he lifted his hands, and in the hand speech he had learned for her sake, that the world had once thought beneath them both, before every lord in the land, he signed slowly, so that even the almshouse children now seated along the back wall, brought up out of the lower city to see the day their tongue was spoken from a throne, could read it plain. Will you stay? Not as my witness, not as my subject, as the one who saw me and did not run. Will you have me? The whole hall leaned in to hear the answer of a woman who could not speak. And Neve, who had been thrown down voiceless and come back up with the loudest silence in the history of Duskmarch, took her time. She let them wait. All of them. The lords who had spent her and the king who had used her and won her and unmade himself to earn her. She let them lean into the quiet the way the quiet had made them lean her whole life. For once, it was not her being made to wait upon the pleasure of the powerful. For once, the powerful waited on her, and she found she was in no hurry at all, and that the waiting did not frighten her, and that she could have held that whole hall in her open hand for as long as she pleased, and every soul in it knew it. Then she reached out and took the kneeling king by both his learned hands, the hands that had bled learning her, and she drew him up off his knee, up to his feet, up level with her, so that he stood not above her as a king, and not below her as a penitent, but even with her, eye to eye, the way the two of them had only ever truly stood in the dark at the bottom of a pit, where neither rank nor voice had counted for anything. And she looked at him, and let her whole face open, the face she had spent a lifetime keeping shut, and she smiled at him, the smile that on her was a whole speech, and she lifted her own hands, and she answered him in the only tongue that had ever been fully hers. Yes, she signed. Stay. Both. The hall broke like a wave over a wall. Somewhere near the back, the almshouse children, who alone had read every word of it firsthand and needed no lord to tell them what it meant, began to cheer in the clapping, stamping, wordless way of those who have just watched their own silent tongues spoken from the highest seat in the land and answered from the floor. And the mute Omega they had thrown in a cage to be rid of stood in the center of the storm, holding both hands of the Alpha King who had come down off his throne and given away his every hold on her to reach her, and did not need a single word to be understood by anyone in Duskmarch. They were wed at the turn of the year, in the plain speech of hands as much as the old words, so that when the vows were made, she could make them herself in her own tongue to the man who had learned it for her. He wept. She had known he would. She did not, quite. Though the bond gave her away as it always did now, wide open and warm and never again to be starved. And he was undone at the sight of her, laughing even as the tears ran, there in front of the whole city, and she let him, and she let everyone see that she let him. Wick stood up with her, scrubbed pink and fierce, the boy who had told her she was not simple when the whole keep had decided she was, and had gone scarlet saying it. She saw to it that he never carried another man's tray unless he wished to, and he found, to his own astonishment, that he wished to learn his letters, and she taught him herself, in the muniment room, the way she had once taught herself in secret and afraid. The pits stayed empty and were filled with stone. The old wing was opened to the light. The school in the lower city filled up with lords' sons and scullery maids learning the same hand speech off the same patient teachers, so that within a few years there were fewer people in Duskmarch who could be spoken over, and the ones who had grown rich on the silence of others found the trade had gone out from under them for good. And in the muniment room, where a dull girl had once stolen her letters among the ledgers, there hung now a small bound book of blank leaves, sewn for one person, the first gift anyone had ever given her that assumed she had something to say, and it was full at last. And there was a second one begun, and a third. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, the king still went down in his other skin and lay across her threshold, out of an old habit neither of them could quite give up, guarding a door that no longer needed guarding. And Neve would come and sit beside the great warm weight of him with her hand flat against his side, over the slow, sure drum of his heart, exactly as she had that first night at the bottom of the world when a killing thing had decided, against every plan of every clever man above them, not to kill her. They had thrown the mute Omega into the Alpha King's cage to prove that the voiceless do not matter. By morning he had guarded her door, and in the end it was her silence, and not his crown, that had saved them both, because the quietest person in the room is so often the only one who is troubled to listen.